In the stillness of the northern dark, where the sun vanishes for weeks and the wind howls like wolves in mourning, a Viking stands before a dwindling fire, staring at a slab of meat that must feed his family through the death grip of winter. This is no ordinary hunger. In these latitudes, food is not just survival, it is the line between legacy and oblivion. Here, in the frostbitten reaches of Scandinavia, salt is as rare as silver. The earth does not yield it, and the coasts offer it only in traces. So how did they do it? How did the Norse seafarers, raiders, poets of the ice keep meat edible for years without the white mineral that civilizations elsewhere took for granted? The answer lies in a pact between man and nature, forged not in abundance, but in scarcity. Long before refrigeration, before preservatives or pasteurization, the Vikings carved out a survival system from cold winds, dense smoke, buried stone pits, and ancient instinct. Each method, each trick, was learned through generations of bitter trial and error by watching which meat spoiled, which mold killed, and which wind saved. In the quiet corners of turf longhouses, dried fish dangled like ghostly banners, and smoked venison hung beside carved runes that told of winters survived and kin remembered. The story of how these warriors tamed rot, defied decay, and fed their bloodlines through brutal seasons is one not only of culinary wisdom but of cultural resilience. This was more than meat. It was memory, endurance, and identity, woven into every sinew. So we begin, not with salt, but with silence, the kind of silence that comes when the land offers nothing but cold, and the only warmth lies in what you can keep from spoiling. This is how the Vikings preserved meat for years, without salt, without mercy, and always against time. Salt. To the ancient world, it was white gold, essential, sacred, and often scarce. In Rome, it paid legions. In Egypt, it embalmed the dead. But in the Viking North, it was a luxury too costly for the everyday soul. The cold, rugged lands of Scandinavia held no natural salt flats, no evaporating pools under a searing Sunday. The salt that did arrive came by trade painfully extracted from kelp ash or imported along fragile merchant routes from the distant south, reserved for ceremonies, sacrifices, or preserving the rarest of delicacies. So while the rest of Europe leaned on salt to keep rot at bay, the Norse turned inward to the forests, the fjords, the chill in the air. There was no room for waste. In a culture where winter devoured months and hunting brought sudden abundance, preserving meat was not a luxury, it was law. And so began a chapter in human adaptation. Few recall. The art of long-term preservation without the world's most trusted mineral. It wasn't stubbornness, it was necessity. The Vikings developed a patchwork of preservation techniques, dictated by geography, season, and clan tradition. Where others salted, they dried. Where others cured, they smoked. Where others fermented with brine, the Norse used air, earth, and fire. This wasn't crude improvisation, it was elegant, ruthless innovation. For the Viking, survival was never passive. It was carved from the ice, smoked in the rafters, and buried deep in the bones of the land. And so the myth falls away. That salt was the only way. In the north, they thrived without it. Not because they lacked civilization, but because they had their own, and it tasted of smoke, stone, and storm. The Norse did not merely survive their land, they negotiated with it. In a region where sunlight was fleeting and warmth a luxury, the environment became both an adversary and an unexpected ally. Preservation, in the Viking Age, was not housed in cellars or cupboards, but in the very breath of the north itself. The biting wind, the sharp drop in temperature, and the dry, crystalline air acted as a natural barrier against decay. They discovered that meat left suspended beneath the eaves of their homes, high above the reach of scavengers, began to change, not rot, but transform. The moisture fled the flesh, drawn out by the relentless air, leaving behind a toughened, dehydrated surface that no spoilage could easily penetrate. These early drying platforms, simple wooden frames, standing like skeletal towers against the snow, were not architecture, but lifelines. Each one held the future of a family. But it wasn't just cold, it was the choreography of elements. Low humidity, constant wind, and shade. The Vikings understood intuitively that direct sunlight could ruin the meat cooking the outside while the inside remained vulnerable. So they chose their spots with care, often along coastal cliffs or high plateaus, where the wind carved lines through the skin like an invisible artisan. No written science guided them, only generational observation, a deep trust in the rhythms of their homeland. There were no thermometers, no timestamps, only the instinct of eyes and nose and touch. The land had rules, and those who broke them fed the worms. But those who listened, who adapted, turned the frostbitten breath of winter into a preservation technique that could outlast seasons and sometimes even wars. In the Viking North, nature wasn't just endured, it was enlisted. Against the backdrop of jagged mountains and mist-swept fjords, wooden drying racks rose like strange sentinels, primitive yet precise structures that turned wind into a butcher's apprentice. These racks, known in some sagas as Hel, were the unsung backbone of Norse preservation. Built from timber stripped of bark, they cradled the meat of elk, deer, boar, and even the occasional seal, their bodies split and spread wide like pages left open to the sky. The placement wasn't random. These racks were angled and spaced to invite airflow from specific directions, optimizing the ever-present northern wind to wick moisture from the meat before decay could set in. Cold, clean, and dry, the perfect conditions for dehydration, as though the gods themselves had designed a climate for survival. It wasn't just meat. Fish, too, especially cod and haddock, were gutted, filleted, and draped like streamers above the cliffs. Children helped string the lines. Women inspected the texture daily, and old warriors, too injured for raids but too proud for rest, often served as silent guardians of the racks, knowing full well that the spoils of the hunt were meaningless if they couldn't last the lean months. As the days passed, the flesh darkened and tightened, becoming leathery, almost indestructible. These dried meats were not for feasting, they were for endurance. Cut with knives, soaked in broth, or chewed like iron-hard jerky, they embodied the Viking spirit, tough, unyielding, forged by the elements. In a world without calendars or guarantees, every rack was a gamble against time. But when done right, these humble constructs could preserve a season's worth of nourishment without a single grain of salt. The drying rack was more than wood and rope, it was a bridge between abundance and famine, summer and winter, life and the long, dark cold. In the dense stillness of a Viking longhouse, where smoke curled like ancient runes above the hearth, preservation became ritual. Fire was not just for warmth, it was a weapon against decay. The Vikings discovered that when meat was suspended above smoldering embers, hours, then days, then weeks, it absorbed more than heat. It took in layers of protection. The smoke, rich in phenols and acids, clung to the meat's surface, forming an invisible shield against bacteria, insects, and time itself. They used alder, birch, and juniper wood trees chosen not for convenience, but for the flavors and antimicrobial properties hidden in their fibers. As the wood burned low and slow, it painted the meat in flavors as deep as fjords and as sharp as northern frost. This was not fast cooking, it was patient transformation. Entire families gathered around these low fires, tending them through day and night, adjusting the smoke flow with primitive flues or cracked stones. Each cut of venison, boar, or mutton took on a dark sheen, a hardened crust that resisted spoilage as if blessed by the gods. And when raids took men from home for weeks or even months, they carried with them these smoked provisions, dense, aromatic, sustaining. Even in foreign lands, one bite brought them back to the hearth, to the watchful eyes of their ancestors. The smoke spoke of safety, of home. It wasn't just preservation, it was identity encoded in scent. In a world ruled by cold and conquest, the Vikings had mastered the art of making time stand still, one ember, one breath of smoke at a time. While salt was rare, fire was everywhere. And so, they turned the elements themselves into allies, wrapping their meat in smoke and memory. The scent of rokt kut, smoked meat, became as familiar in Viking settlements as the clash of axes or the lull of ocean waves. This wasn't just food, it was tradition rendered edible. The process, honed over generations, grew into a cornerstone of Norse identity, a culinary ritual passed from mother to daughter, father to son. In the dark, timbered smokehouses at the edge of villages, meat was hung like offerings to unseen gods. swaying gently in the thick gray haze that never cleared. Each cut, each joint, was handled with care, sometimes massaged with wild herbs or dipped in fermented whey before meeting the smoke. The method varied from fjord to forest, but the spirit was the same: transform the perishable into permanence. As the meat aged, its exterior hardened into a shell-like crust, while the inside retained its dense, nutritious core. This was not just sustenance for winter, but a preparation for war, for sea voyages, for long hunts across hostile terrain. Among chieftains, roaked coat was a mark of status, sometimes gifted to visiting allies or exchanged in sacred feasts to honor the dead. But even in the humblest homes, a smoked haunch of venison was a symbol of security, proof that the family had endured the hunt and was ready for the storm. And when the skies turned pale and the fjords froze over, these precious cuts were unwrapped like relics, chewed beside the hearth, dipped into thick stews, or eaten raw with hard bread. Each bite carried the warmth of fire, the memory of summer, and the quiet triumph of survival. In the Viking world, where life was short and glory hard-won, roaked cut endured smoke-wrapped, time-tested, and as fierce as the people who made it. Beneath layers of snow and silence, another method emerged, one born of accident, perhaps, but perfected by need: fermentation. The Vikings, though illiterate to modern microbiology, were masters of observation. They noticed that when meat was sealed in barrels or buried in peat bogs, it did not rot as expected. Instead, it transformed. Bacterial action, slowed by cold and starved of oxygen, fermented the flesh in a slow, alchemical process. The results were pungent, often repulsive to outsiders, but safe, nutritious, and long-lasting. In the coastal villages of what would become Norway and Iceland, fermented shark known today as hakarl became a legacy of this tradition, though its roots may reach even deeper into the Viking past. Lamb, seal, and even seabirds were subjected to similar techniques. In some clans, slabs of meat were packed tightly into wooden barrels with layers of moss and lichen, then sealed with animal fat or birch bark. These containers were placed in cold crevices, caves, or dug into the earth where temperatures stayed stable. Months later, the meat would emerge darker, softer, reeking but edible. Fermented meat required courage to eat and wisdom to prepare. A single misstep could mean sickness or worse, but when done right, it yielded a supply that could endure voyages, sieges, and lean winters. Elders claimed the fermented meats gave strength, even visions. Warriors swore it sharpened the senses. To the modern tongue, it might seem unbearable, but to a Viking, it was proof that time itself could be tricked. Where the sea froze and crops failed, they had found a way to store life in the very decay that threatened it. Fermentation was their hidden art, a quiet defiance against the rot that stalked every shadow. When the winds grew too violent and the snow too thick, even the air turned against the Norse, and so they turned inward into the earth itself. Beneath their longhouses or beside frozen hillsides, Vikings carved out underground cellars and dug deep pits, lined with stone, clay, or timber. These weren't mere holes, they were engineered sanctuaries where meat could outlast the seasons. Within these frost-kissed chambers, slabs of smoked, dried, or even freshly boiled meat were layered with straw, moss, or hay, natural insulators that absorbed moisture and warded off insects. Snow was not the enemy here. It was a trusted sealant. In the dead of winter, Vikings packed their meat stores with snow and ice, tamped tight like mortar, then covered the top with turf. The result was a natural refrigeration system that maintained its chill long after the surface thawed. Some cellars were communal, protected by superstition, and guarded by elders who passed down their secrets in murmured tones. Others were private hidden caches known only to families, marked by runes or animal bones to ward off both man and beast. The placement was critical. Too close to water, and thaw risked spoilage. Too dry, and the meat would crack and crumble. But when conditions were perfect, these subterranean vaults could preserve meat not just for a winter, but for years, nourishing sons not yet born, sustaining warriors yet to lift a sword. In a culture that revered what the earth took, they also learned to respect what it could give back: cold, dark, quiet, longevity. These underground spaces weren't just storage, they were wombs of survival. And while the sun abandoned them for months, the Vikings looked beneath their feet and found in the frozen dirt the promise of one more spring. Along the rugged coastlines where cliffs met the crashing sea, the air carried a different kind of power. It wasn't just the inland meats that demanded preservation fish. The lifeblood of many Viking settlements required its own sacred process. Enter the art of air drying, especially of cod, which would become known across generations as stockfish. On open wooden racks called hegel, thousands of gutted fish were strung head, down in long symmetrical rows, swaying like ghostly banners under the northern sky. No salt, no smoke, just wind and patience. The Arctic breeze, dry and cold, acted like a silent craftsman, extracting moisture day by day while preserving the protein-rich core. It was a slow transformation that took weeks, even months. But when done correctly, the fish became nearly indestructible, hard as driftwood, light to carry, and able to last for years. Entire families took part in this coastal choreography. Children threaded twine through the gills, women scaled and gutted by hand, and men climbed the tall racks to hang the catch before the frost set in. It was a communal dance with the elements, synchronized with the tide and the seasons. The dried fish, though hard as stone, softened again in boiling stews or when pounded with mallets, a technique still used in parts of Scandinavia today. It fueled not only households, but also the hulls of longships bound for trade or raid. Lightweight, portable, immune to spoilage, it became a portable pantry for the wandering Norse. And so, with nothing but wood, wind, and wisdom, the Vikings mastered a preservation method that rivaled salt-based curing in endurance and simplicity. The sea had offered them its bounty, and the sky, in turn, gave them the means to keep it. In that partnership, stockfish was born, and with it, the quiet confidence of never facing winter hungry. In the Viking world, no part of a kill was discarded not out of reverence, but necessity. Blood, bones, tendons, organs, each was a resource waiting to be transformed. While slabs of muscle fed warriors and families, it was the less glamorous remnants that filled the larders in leaner months. Blood, rich in iron and protein, was whipped with barley and herbs into thick puddings or baked into flat cakes, then dried near the hearth or smoked like meat. Organs were boiled, stuffed, and preserved in animal stomachs, creating primitive sausages that could be hung in cool air or tucked into snow-packed storage pits. Even bones were broken down, roasted to extract marrow, then sun-dried and crushed into powder added to stews long after meat supplies dwindled. This wasn't indulgence, it was survival by mathematics. Every ounce mattered. Every sinew was a strategy. The skins wrapped other cuts. The fat was rendered and poured over meats as a sealant against bacteria. Intestines became casings, bladders turned into airtight containers. What others might burn or bury, the Vikings repurposed with brutal efficiency. Hunters weren't just skilled with axe or bow, they were butchers, chemists, and architects of preservation. Around the fire, children learned to differentiate organs by smell and texture. Elders judged spoilage by sound and weight. And women measured preservation not in days, but in stories, recipes born in famine, passed through generations like sacred lore. This total use of the animal wasn't just practical, it was a worldview shaped by the unspoken law of the North. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. In a land where winter showed no mercy, victory wasn't won on the battlefield. But in the smokehouse, in the pit, in the pot, and in the sacred refusal to let anything die in vain. As autumn's gold faded into the gray hush of approaching winter, the Viking homestead transformed into a hive of preparation. It was not just about preserving meat, it was about preparing the spirit. The act of storing food was ceremonial, almost sacred, especially for the winter feast. In the longhouse, beneath rafters blackened by years of smoke, preserved meat was sorted by type, age, and origin. Smoked venison from the mountains, dried cod from the coast, fermented seal packed in birch barrels, all laid in careful layers like offerings to time itself. Children were hushed, wide-eyed, watching as their elders murmured quiet words over each cut. Not prayers, but memories. This came from your uncle's last hunt, or we caught this during the storm of the broken mast. Meat was identity, encoded in scent and story. Bundles were wrapped in straw and tucked into stone niches. Others buried beneath turf mounds behind the house, marked with carved runes or simple stones. A single mistake in this ritual could cost lives. Too much moisture meant rot. Too little insulation invited the gnawing teeth of foxes and rats. Each bundle was tested by hand, by nose, by intuition. The final sealing was done on the first frost, when the earth itself became a lock. And then came silence. For months, the stores were left untouched, a forbidden garden of hope beneath the snow. But when the darkest nights arrived, when the gods seemed distant and the wolves drew close, the meat was unveiled, one cut at a time, shared by firelight among kin, a taste of summer in the heart of ice. The winter feast was more than survival. It was proof that the clan had outwitted nature one more time, that their hands, their rituals, their stubborn memory had turned death into delay. Beyond their villages, beyond the fjords and the forests, the Vikings sailed into legend, and their preserved meat sailed with them. These weren't weekend journeys. Viking expeditions stretched for weeks, sometimes months, across icy channels and open sea. Fresh food would spoil within days, but dried, smoked, and fermented provisions endured. Bundled in linen, wrapped in hide, or packed into watertight barrels sealed with wax or pitch, preserved meat became the original longship ration. Warriors chewed strips of smoked lamb during night watches, softened dried fish in seawater, or boiled fermented cuts into thick stews in iron pots strapped to swaying hearths aboard the ship. The meat gave them strength, but it also gave them identity. To eat from the stores of your homeland while floating beyond sight of its shores was a spiritual anchor, a tether of flavor that reminded you who you were and why you sailed. On raids, these rations fueled the assault. On trade missions, they became gifts or bartering chips. Scandinavian smoked goods held value in foreign markets where salt-preserved meats dominated. The compact weight, durability, and calorie density of these foods made them ideal for travel long before the invention of the canteen or mess kit. And more than once, they saved lives when winds died, when ports were closed, when sickness swept the crew. The preserved meat endured, stoic and unchanged, waiting to be called upon. Even on funerary journeys, when a chieftain was laid in a burning ship, his burial cargo included preserved food, a final feast for the voyage beyond. Viking preservation wasn't just about outlasting winter. It was about extending life across impossible distances, carrying their homeland not just in steel and sail, but in every bite torn from smoked flesh under foreign stars. In the shadows of the hearth and the silence between storms, it was not the warriors who guarded the secrets of preservation. It was the women and the elders. While the sagas sang of blood and blades, the true magic of survival rested in their weathered hands. Women, often the keepers of the home while men hunted or raided, oversaw every step of preservation. They selected the wood for smoking, gauged the wind for drying, and judged the meat's readiness not by measure, but by memory. Their noses could detect a hint of sourness before rot took hold. Their fingers, calloused from years of butchery, knew the difference between good flesh and doomed flesh. Recipes weren't written, they were whispered learned by doing, passed down by doing wrong and being corrected. A glance, a taste, a nod. That was the schooling of Viking preservation. And alongside them stood the elders, men too old to sail but too proud to fade. They remembered famines others forgot. Remembered the year the snow came early, the year the meat had to be buried in bogs because the cellars overflowed. Their knowledge was a map not of land, but of survival. They taught when to move the meat higher on the racks, when the fire would burn too wet, when the wind came from the wrong side of the mountain. Together, these quiet figures formed a living archive, preserving not just food, but culture itself. Every successful winter was a song unsung, a war won without a single scream. In Viking life, strength wasn't only measured by sword swing, it was measured in smoked ribs, in dried marrow, in fermented seal packed with care by hands, wrinkled by time and sharpened by necessity. In the frostbitten economy of the Viking world, meat was more than nourishment, it was currency, status, and power preserved in flesh. A haunch of smoked reindeer could be traded for iron tools. A barrel of fermented fish might secure winter furs, and dried lamb ribs, aged to perfection, were sometimes presented as diplomatic gifts between chieftains. These preserved provisions, long-lasting and portable, moved through trade routes like silent ambassadors of the Norse way of life. Wealth wasn't just in land or weapons, it was measured by how well one could feed a crew through winter or a journey across the sea. A well-stocked smokehouse was a vault, and those who managed its contents held a quiet influence over clan survival. During seasonal gatherings and thing assemblies, where disputes were settled and alliances forged, the quality of preserved meat on offer could sway judgment as much as any oath. Elders judged a family's honor not only by bravery or gold, but by the flavor of their smoked cuts, the subtle scent of birchwood smoke, the resilience of a dried leg, the tang of a fermented slice. These flavors told stories of patience, of stewardship, of ancient knowledge carried without parchment. Even in burial, preserved meats were interred with the dead, packed beside weapons and amulets as provisions for the next life. They weren't just food, they were offerings to the divine, symbols of earthly skill and celestial hope. And as the Vikings traveled farther to England, to Francia, to Byzantium, their preservation methods traveled with them, leaving echoes in the culinary techniques of lands they touched. Meat, once the spoils of a hunt, became something transcendent, a vehicle for trade, a tool of diplomacy, a monument to the ingenuity of a people who turned time itself into an ingredient. Even now, centuries removed from the clang of axes and the howl of northern winds, the spirit of Viking preservation lingers in smokehouses tucked into Scandinavian forests, in cellar-cured meats shared at winter tables, in the sharp tang of hackar or the leathery resilience of stockfish. Modern chefs may wield thermometers and stainless steel, but the essence is the same, harnessing time, temperature, and the primal elements to suspend decay and celebrate endurance. In Iceland, whole shark carcasses still ferment under rock, echoing ancient methods with modern ritual. In Sweden and Norway, reindeer and elk are still cold-smoked with alderwood, honoring not only flavor but ancestry. These are not relics, they are continuations. The science behind them is caught up, yes, but the soul remains rooted in the old ways. The Vikings didn't merely preserve meat, they preserved a relationship with the natural world that modern life has all but forgotten. They trusted their senses, their seasons, their elders. They listened to the wind, watched the mold, respected the cold. Their ingenuity was not written in books, it was woven into muscle, into memory, into the invisible language shared between a hunter and his kill, between fire and flesh. In a world starved for permanence, the Norse found a way to make food outlast famine, to make knowledge outlast death. And in doing so, they built more than empires, they built methods. Methods that, in a world of excess, still whisper the value of patience, simplicity, and survival. From smoke to cellar, from ice to fire. This is how the Vikings preserved meat for years without salt, without compromise, and without forgetting who they were.